morning, everybody. Welcome to our February 2018 Early Achievers Coaching Webinar. Today, we are thrilled to have a guest presenter, Wendy Jans from UW's Cultivate Learning. And we will have lots of opportunities for coaches to participate and contribute to the learning environment throughout the webinar. So we look forward to hearing from you throughout the webinar. Just a reminder, as you're signing in and settling in and getting ready for the webinar, to look at the field down at the bottom left of your screen when you're looking at your chat box. And in the drop-down field that says "To," be sure to select all panelists and attendees. The default setting is all panelists, and that means that only Kelly, Wendy, and myself can see the comments and questions and feedback that's being shared in the chat box. So if you want to take a moment now just to double check that you have all panelists and attendees selected in the "To" field, then everybody will be able to see the great feedback from all of our coaches. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, please comment in the chat box. Mark from Cultivate Learning is online with us, and he will be able to provide technical assistance. So welcome, everybody. This is Jen Fung from the University of Washington's Herring Center, and I am thrilled to be here with everyone this morning.
And this is Kelly DeBoer from the ECAP office at the Department of Early Learning, and I'm looking forward to all we have to share today.
Great, and as I mentioned, we also have Wendy Jans with us today. We are thrilled to have Wendy. She is extremely knowledgeable and an experienced coach and trainer. So we'll introduce Wendy in a moment, but thank you so much, Wendy, for being here, and we look forward to hearing everything you have to say. Just a quick overview of today's webinar. We'll start with a few announcements and then move into our content focused on motivational interviewing for coaches. We'll wrap up by sharing some coaching resources and then have some time for question and answer from the field, as always. If there are any questions or concerns during the webinar, please do use the chat box. Kelly and I will be monitoring that, and we will respond in the chat box throughout. And occasionally throughout the webinar, we will field questions that are related to the motivational interviewing content to Wendy. So some upcoming training announcements offered by UW. There is a new coach framework training in the Tri-Cities on March 13th and 14th. If you click on the link in the PDF version of the webinar slides that were sent out with the webinar reminder, it will take you to the link for the registration for that training. I will also in the chat box be sharing some more information about where to access information about the trainings offered by Cultivate Learning. In terms of ERS trainings, there's a Fickers Deep Dive in Yakima on March 2nd. And there's a toddler class reliability training in Olympia on March 15th and 16th. There is a full list of trainings offered by Cultivate Learning if you click on the Here link. As I mentioned, I will also share that information, a link to access the full yearly calendar of trainings offered by Cultivate in the chat box in just a moment. We have several Herring Center individualization internships that still have spots available for CCA coaches, ECAP coaches, and infant toddler coaches. So if you've been interested in the individualization internships and haven't yet been able to sign up, then please definitely check out the registration link. Registration is on a first-come, first-served basis, and for most of the sessions, we're getting down to our last few spots. So definitely act quickly if you are interested in attending a Herring Center individualization internship. Thank you so much to everybody who responded to the survey that Kelly and I sent out in January. For an opportunity for coaches to provide input and feedback on future webinar topics that you'd like to see. We had a really great response, and we saw some really consistent feedback. So based on the feedback that was shared through that survey, we've selected topics for the final 4 webinars of the year based on what we heard from you. So the topic this month, motivational interviewing, was one of the most requested topics, as well as executive functioning, both for children and for adults, strategies, growth mindset, fostering a growth mindset, both in children and adults, again. And then the most requested topic was adult resiliency, so addressing provider stress in the classroom. So thank you all again. We just wanted you to know that we value your feedback. We appreciate everyone who took the time to provide that feedback. And based on your feedback, we will be addressing those most requested topics for March, April, and May webinars. We'll also keep this feedback in mind as the coaching webinars for next year are planned, as we received a lot of really wonderful and, again, as I mentioned, consistent requests, and we won't be able to cover all the topics this year. The survey is still accepting responses if you'd like to provide feedback for consideration for next year's webinars, and I will share that link in the chat box in a moment for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to participate in the survey yet. Okay, so now we'll move into our content, and I am very pleased and happy to introduce Wendy Jans. Many of you know Wendy. Wendy is the Coach Support Team Lead at Cultivate Learning. She's currently one of the instructors in the practice-based coaching certificate, and just started with the second cohort of coaches who are accessing that certificate program. Wendy provides individual consultation to coaches around the state. She co-facilitates the new coach framework trainings and presents sessions at the Early Achievers Institutes. She has been a coach, mentor, and a reflective supervisor. So welcome, Wendy. Thank you, and we look forward to all the great information you have to share.
Well, thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. And Kelly, it's great to have this opportunity today to discuss motivational interviewing techniques and strategies, since that was a topic that you all thought would be really helpful. So as this slide says, when coaches assist providers or teachers in coming up with their own answers and ideas, the greater the likelihood that they'll be successful in implementing those ideas. And so today we're going to talk about how, as coaches, you can use some of these techniques and strategies from motivational interviewing to help providers and teachers be successful in reaching the goals they set for themselves through that collaborative partnership. So just a bit of background on motivational interviewing, and you have a handout for the webinar that is actually an excerpt from the book by Miller and Rolnick with the same title. And the techniques outlined in their book are intended to help, and they refer to clients, and you can interchange client with teacher or provider. So to help clients with making changes in their behavior and reaching goals that they set for themselves. Some of you may know that the field of chemical dependency treatment used motivational interviewing strategies and techniques to help clients deal with changing addictive behavior. Many other professionals got a hold of this material and information and thought, working with adults in different capacities, these motivational interviewing techniques can be very helpful in working on changing behavior, or in our case, teaching practices, and working through the barriers that might get in the way of teachers or providers reaching their goals. So as you can see in this slide, there are several specific behaviors from motivational interviewing that are helpful to include in your coaching practice. And some of these might be familiar to you already. I'm sure they are. The first one, seeking to understand the person's frame of reference, particularly via reflective listening, really reminds me of that core coaching skill of mindful listening, right? So as a coach, it's important to listen more than we talk during a coaching session. And we always want to be accepting and affirming with teachers and providers, that's that second one, rather than being judgmental or evaluative. So the last three bullets, those last three behaviors, we're going to explore in more detail as we continue. We're going to look at eliciting and reinforcing the client's own self, motivational statements, monitoring their degree of readiness to change, and not jumping ahead of the client, teacher, or provider, and affirming their freedom of choice and self-direction. So some of you who are more familiar or maybe have attended a training on motivational interviewing will know that one of the, I really think eliciting change talk is at the heart of this work. And so one strategy for eliciting change talk is called evoking. And evoking is about using skillful questions like the ones that are in this slide. What might make you ready in the future to change? Or can you think of a time in the future you might be ready to change? And so another big part of motivational interviewing is working with ambivalence. Most of us experience a certain degree of ambivalence when trying to make a change in our behavior or practice. There are two very effective strategies for working with ambivalence that we're going to focus on, and you're going to have a chance to practice today. So let's look at the first one, and that's the pros-cons discussion. This is really that first technique for helping a teacher or provider work through ambivalence about making a change in their practice. And one way to do that is to have what motivational interviewing calls a pros-cons discussion. This facilitates an exploration of the good things and the not so good things about making a change in practice. It also explores the good and not so good things about not making that change. So I wanted to share an example to kind of make this a little bit more real or relevant. So you might be working, for example, with a toddler teacher who has a goal of wanting to shorten her circle time for toddlers. And because it's been too long, it's been about 25 minutes. And so as the coach, you might ask this teacher, what are some of the good things and not so good things about having a shorter circle time? And then you could follow that with, what are some of the good things and not so good things about continuing to have a 25-minute circle time for toddlers? And the way to set this up is really kind of like a chart. So pros and cons chart. You can make I can't really show you this on the slide, but you could make a 4-square form and put pros on one side and cons on the other. And then 2 squares are, if I do make this change, what are the pros and cons of that? And the other 2 squares are, if I don't make this change, then what are the pros and cons of that? Once you have the teacher provider fill all of those boxes in, then you can look at it together and ask, what do you make of all of this? What does this bring up for you? What do you think? So in motivational interviewing, one of the strategies that is really big is that concept of decisional balance. So decisional balance is really working with the pros and cons of changing. And after looking at the pros and cons chart, in addition to asking what do you make of this, you can ask these additional questions that are on the slide. So getting back to the goal of having a shorter circle time with toddlers for this toddler teacher. Let's say the teacher in your observations, or she shared with you, that she actually implemented a shorter circle time on 2 days, but not 5. You could ask, what were those 2 times like? Rather than asking, why didn't you do it every day, which would be tempting, but not helpful. So what were those 2 times like? Acknowledges that this teacher actually did implement something that she wants to change, but she's not quite there yet. And then you can ask things like, what would be the consequences if you don't do it every day? Or how would you feel if you did actually have a shorter circle time every day? So another way of working on readiness to change is, in addition to the pros and cons chart, a different technique is called the readiness ruler. And some of you may be familiar with this as well. this is a really great visual way, as well as a pros and cons chart, but a visual way for someone to see where they are on a scale of 1 to 10. So you can have a teacher or provider actually write the numbers down from 1 through 10 on a piece of paper, and then you can ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it for you to make this change? So if, in the toddler circle time example, how important is it for you to have a shorter circle time? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you could make this change? So that's an important point. We want to look at how ready is someone to make this change in their practice, but we also want to look at their confidence level, because if they're not feeling confident about making that change, the likelihood of them implementing it is pretty low. I just also wanted to add that most people will respond better to either one or the other, either the pros cons chart or the readiness ruler. And so you can try either one or try both and see what works better. So after, and this is a continuation of the readiness ruler. So after a teacher or provider has placed themselves on that ruler, the readiness and the confidence ruler, you can ask these first two questions to examine possible barriers of making the change and points of resistance. So why didn't you place yourself at a lower number? Or why didn't you place yourself at a higher number? Most people can come up with those answers pretty quickly. This is a really effective tool. The third question there, what would it take for you to get to a higher number, encourages solutions for potential options of working on making that change. So you can also ask, how can I support you in making this change? So one of your handouts is called Motivational Interviewing, and it explains some different techniques. It talks about, it has the evoking and ambivalence, decisional balance, pros, cons, and then the second page is the readiness ruler. So you have this information with you, and you're going to be referring to that when we do some activities really soon, which is like right now. So now you're going to have a chance to try out using one of these techniques. And what we want you to do is think of a behavior or practice that you yourself would like to change. So it can be personal or professional. For the purpose of this activity today, it doesn't matter. We just want to give you a chance to try these out. So think of a behavior or practice you'd like to change, and then try using the pros cons chart or the readiness ruler to assess your motivation. So your readiness and your confidence. And then use the chat box to share what you learned about these techniques. So when you actually write your comments in the chat box, it would be really helpful if you could identify which technique you used, whether it was the pros cons chart or the readiness ruler. Okay, so I think people are hopefully going to take a little time to look at this and actually, have a chance to do or try it out and then write their comments. This could take a while because I actually have to do something and then.
looks like one coach has responded, sharing that she's used the readiness ruler in her past work. And it's really forced people to assess the value they place on the change and why that might be. And it's a helpful reflection tool and really increases efficacy for change.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that.
And then Terry shared that she used the readiness ruler and it really helped her to identify some of the barriers to making the change. And she feels this will help her to address some of the barriers and find solutions that will make it more likely for her to follow through. So thank you, Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. And Terry was a student in the first cohort of the Coach Certificate. And we actually talked quite a bit about some of these strategies and coaching skills.
And then Patty shared that she used both tools to assess the pros and cons around her readiness to report and do follow-up emails after each site visit or provider contact.
Oh, that's great.
And then Jamie shared she really liked the pros and cons chart to lay out what is holding her back and what the change in behavior would benefit her.
That's wonderful, yes. And that's really the purpose, is to do exactly that, to identify what might be getting in the way or what some of those barriers are.
Lori shared the pros and cons list has helped her recognize how much she wants to make the change. And the readiness ruler tool helped her gauge her belief about her confidence and motivation to actually make the change.
Oh, that's great, Lori. So you're looking at using both strategies, the pros cons chart and the readiness ruler. And I like that you identified the aspect of confidence in terms of being ready to make the change.
And then another coach shared that she tried the pros and cons chart and realized that there are more pros than cons in changing a behavior. And
glad there were more pros.
And Carmen shares that she tried it herself today and chose to use the pros and cons chart and found it was helpful to identify the reasons to make the change, and it helped her to find more motivation. So thank you for the activity. It's fun.
I'm glad it was fun, and it should be. It shouldn't be tedious.
And Michelle shared that she prefers the pros and cons model. It's very helpful for her to look more at the facts and less about her feelings about the proposed change. The readiness ruler was also very useful in group training sessions, she found.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Michelle, for pointing that out. And I have, if some of you have, whoever has come to the new coach training knows that we do a group readiness ruler, which is really fun. So you have the participants stand in a line, 1 being on one end of the room, 10 on the other. And you can use that for all kinds of trainings or meetings. So thanks for pointing that out.
And it looks like another coach says, I use the readiness ruler to assess my motivation in using motivational interviewing strategies with my coaching sites. Now that I've learned more strategies, I'm more willing to use them.
Oh, that's terrific. I'm really glad to hear about that.
And Wendy, it looks like Patty's asking if there's a worksheet that can be used with providers for both pros and cons and the readiness ruler.
And Patty, that's a good question, but I don't have a actual worksheet. I just really, when I use the pros and cons strategy, I literally do what I said earlier, which is just kind of make a 4-square diagram on a piece of paper and then fill it in. But you could probably create one like that you could copy and use. And then the readiness ruler, I don't have a worksheet for that either, but you could, like I said, just have somebody write that out, or you could just talk about it. So yeah, I don't have a worksheet, but I would be thrilled to see what somebody else might come up with for that.
It looks like Claudia shared that she really likes to apply the decisional balance strategy on personal goals because she feels it would help her to truly reflect and analyze the progress and outcomes of her goals, and feels that it will help her to see her goal in a much bigger picture.
Thanks for that, Claudia. Yeah, I think so too. It really does encourage reflection and analyzing the whole process of change. And so I'm glad to hear you point that out. Thanks.
And Becky shared, for my own behavior change, I liked the readiness ruler for identifying barriers. These strategies would be great to include in the certificate program too.
Hi, Becky. Yes, Becky was one of our students in the first cohort. And this is some content that actually Nina did present. Nina Auerbach was one of our instructors in the in-person sessions for the coach certificate. She did present the readiness ruler in the in-person days, the first course. And I agree. I think it's very important that we do include it. Thank you.
So Wendy, if you wanted to go ahead and go on, if coaches are still adding to it, we can please continue to add your responses, and we will get to them at the next moment. So.
Okay, that sounds great. We can move on. So the next thing we're going to look at is the contemplation change model, and you have a handout for this as well. So I would love for you to refer to that as I talk about it. So if we look at this model of change, we notice that there are different phases of change that one goes through. And this model helps us really understand those phases of change that teachers and providers might be going through and being ready to change their teaching practices. In addition to defining each of these phases, this model, this handout, provides some information on how to support a teacher or provider who is in the particular phase of change. As we discussed earlier, motivational interviewing emphasizes the need to meet a client, teacher or provider, where they're at in the process of changing their behavior or practice. It would never be effective to try and push a teacher or provider to the next phase if they're not ready. So as you can see, there are 5 phases of change. The first one is pre-contemplation, and this is really when someone is not open to changing at all. And you can give or share information at this point, but really and truly, that person is probably not going to be open to this and ready at all. So as this handout says, please do leave the door open. Don't drop the conversation, but come back to it. And you can also have a conversation using the pros and cons chart of a practice staying the same or changing. So in this pre-contemplation phase, having a pros-cons conversation could be very effective. The next phase is the contemplation phase. And at this point, people are thinking about it, thinking about making that change in their practice. And as this handout says, it can be very easy to move too fast here and kind of rush ahead of where somebody's at. And so you will probably be most successful in this phase if you do look at the pros and cons or the readiness ruler. The person can begin to see some positive benefits of making this change, and that's something that's going to motivate them to go forward. And in this phase, you can ask questions like, what's your motivation? Or why do you want to do this? What could get in the way? And what are some barriers? You can also, as I said, use the readiness ruler. And you can ask, who can support you in making this change? And I would always add, how can I support you in making this change? The preparation phase is the next phase. And this is where a provider teacher has decided that they really do want to make that change in their practice, and they're really preparing for it. They're getting ready. It's helpful during this phase to really look at resources that are going to provide support and identify the barriers that will get in the way of making the change. So that identifying resources for support and barriers are key. The next phase is the action phase, and this is when a teacher or provider is actively engaged in making that change in their practice. And you can expect some ups and downs. It's not going to be just a smooth sailing. So during this phase, it's important to recognize any attempts that are successful in making that change in practice. And I gave that example earlier about the toddler teacher shortening her circle time. I wouldn't focus on the fact that she didn't do it every day. I would celebrate the fact that she did it those 2 times. And so, and this goes on to talk about just that, focusing on what they did accomplish and build on that by asking them how they felt about it. And then you can explore what got in the way of not doing it every day and problem solve what they can do about it. The last phase of the contemplation change model is the maintenance phase. And at this point, a teacher or provider has been actually engaged in that practice for a while. So there's lots of opportunities here to fall back into old habits. And one thing that can really help in this stage is to suggest that that teacher or provider serves as a mentor to others who are trying to actually implement the same practice that they are now really skilled at. By being a mentor to another teacher or provider, that will help cement what they're already doing. That'll really solidify it. And it's also important, even though someone is in this last phase of the change, the maintenance phase, it's important to check in, because as I already said, it's possible that we can slip a little backwards, and we want to make sure that what we're doing gets reinforced. So those are the 5 phases of the contemplation change model. And so now what we want you to do is think of a provider, teacher, or maybe a director who you're working with on changing a specific teaching practice or a practice in the center or their own home, or changing, working on it, changing behavior with children. So it's either a teaching practice or trying to get different behavior plan with a child, any kind of change. Using the chat box to share your answers to the following prompts. Where would you place them in this model? So first you want to think about who that person is you're working with and what they're working on, and then figure out, based on these phases of change, where would you place them at this point? Where are they at? Which phase? And then answering the question, how can you support them in that current phase that they're in? Hi, so I see that one of the participants asked, is there a slide that lists all 5 phases? I don't have a slide in this presentation today with that, but you have the handout that Jen sent out prior to the webinar, and it's actually titled Contemplation Change Model, and that is the handout that lists all the phases of change.
And it looks like Jamie shared, she just shadowed because she's new in her role. She shadowed on a visit to a center and feels like the director she's working with is in the action phase. She saw the coach who she was shadowing really focus on the attempts they made since the last visit and help problem solve to continue making those lasting changes to the environment. And it was really wonderful to see that in action. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you. That's terrific.
And another coach shares she has a teacher in the action phase. She's definitely having ups and downs in meeting her goal and doing some videoing in the classroom. And at coaching sessions, we watch video segments of her being successful and discuss how it's going and where she wants to go next.
That sounds really great. And I'm just wondering if that's, if this is also an opportunity to use some of those questions that we've discussed today about how can I support you? What are some of the resources that are in place and what are some barriers?
And it looks like Shauna shared that she has 2 that are in the contemplation phase and 1 in the action. She's been working hard with those in the contemplation phase to build that personal relationship and taking it 1 step at a time with lots of listening.
Thank you, Shauna. To hear about as well. And you're doing exactly what needs in the contemplation phase, which is to continue to build that relationship and explore the benefits of making the change and what might get in the way. So it sounds like you're on the right track.
And then another coach has shared she has a teacher in the contemplation phase. She has noticed that change needs to happen, and I can help support her by helping find resources for her to move towards change. It also helps to problem solve what the barriers may be for changing.
That sounds really good.
And then another coach shared she's working with a provider who feels who might be between pre-contemplation and contemplation. And they met recently and discussed her readiness to change, and she's not ready yet. So they discussed a timeline for when this individual might be ready in the future, and maybe by the end of the school, she says. She may progress to the contemplation and will try to use the pros and cons when the conversation comes up again. Right now, I'm leaving the door open. And thank you for revisiting these strategies.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for sharing what you're working on, because it sounds like you've got a great action plan developed, which is to revisit things and also to provide resources and leaving the door open. So thank you for sharing that.
And then another coach shared in her case, her example, her client is vested in the strategies that she's currently using. And this coach is wondering if the pros and cons process would reveal information to help them both identify a next step in the conversation.
Oh, I hope so. That would be terrific. I hope it really does help. And you can certainly try it out and see what happens.
And another coach shared when the provider is in what is called pre-contemplation, it can be frustrating as a coach when you're feeling pressure to support the teacher towards successful practice. It's helpful to recognize that there is a need to accept where each person is and that we can help with naming the reluctance.
Absolutely true. It can be very frustrating to work with someone in the pre-contemplation phase. However, as you pointed out yourself, you're already seeing that you have to accept where they're at. We can't force somebody to go to the next phase if they're not ready, but we certainly can support them in the process, and it sounds like that's what you're doing.
And then another coach shared she's working with a provider who has moved from a long phase in contemplation to the action phase. And her strategies now are to provide as many resources as possible for the environment as well as in class, and making herself available as needed to keep that motivation going.
Well, congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment to go from the contemplation phase to the action phase. And I'm really happy to hear about that experience. And I agree that providing as many resources as you can about the class will be very helpful. And then, of course, as you said, too, making yourself available to, as you pointed out, keep the motivation going. That's great.
Great. Well, if anybody has any further thoughts or questions, please feel free to share those in the chat box as we move through the rest of the slides. Thanks for everyone's great feedback.
Yes, thank you so much.
Looks like someone said, one is in the action for my providers, and it's lovely when they take action. One example being that she'll record herself to better see the positiveness in her own observations with child interactions and extension of back and forth communication.
Oh, that's a great experience to share. Thank you for that. And I think that whenever you can encourage a provider or teacher to video record themselves, that's really helpful. In addition to you video recording, but if that themselves, that's even better, because then it's less intimidating and it puts it in their court. And I think that it's really probably one of the most effective professional development tools. So thanks.
It looks like we want to open it up to any questions or thoughts that you have for Wendy.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And we can continue, and if people have questions, they can continue to write them in the chat box if you want to move on.
Why don't we go ahead and move on, Wendy, and then people can continue to write their questions. We'll have opportunity at the end, too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So here are some coaching resources. We wanted to share information on Cultivate Learning's Meaningful Makeover. And so there is a link in the slide here. You'll have access to that on the PDF of the webinar that went out with the coaching reminder. And it looks like Jennifer has linked it into the chat box as well. And then just want to remind folks about Cultivate Learning Circle Time magazine. So episode 1 was focused on math and mathematizing, and it looks like it's available in both English and Spanish as well. And then just want to share with you all about the coach consultation opportunities. And so you can click this link here to access any of these amazing coach consultants. And they all have different specialty areas, and you can schedule time with each of them. So you would follow the link and look at their bios and see who would be the best fit for the topic you're looking for some consultation with, and then you can click on that individual and have access to their calendar. So some other coaching resources that are available are the Cultivate Learning's online coaching tools, the Coaching Companion, and the DEL Coaching Toolkit. And then as far as who to contact, so if you have an ECAP specific policy related question or technical assistance, you would want to reach out to the pre-K specialist who's assigned to your program, and you can follow this link to find out who that is if you don't know that information already. If you need assistance with WELS or have a WELS specific question, the QRIS@del.wa.gov email, and then in webinar technical assistance is Mark McCarty, who's on the line with us today. And then for any coaching related questions, you can reach out to myself, Kelly DeBoer, or Jennifer Fung, and our emails are linked here. And it looks like our next webinar is Friday, March 2nd at 9 o'clock. And it looks like we're getting a few questions. Jen included the link for coach consultation. Thank you, Jen, for putting that in there. And I will try to access my email to get to the handout that Patty sent out. If we don't link it here today, we'll send it out with the post-webinar survey. Thank you, Patty, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you, Patty, for sharing that. That's terrific. And thanks, Kelly, as well. And thanks, Jen, for including the link to sign up for coach consultation.
Absolutely. I've tried to include some links. They all are live links in the PDF version of the slides, but I wanted to also link them here in the chat box so that people could check out those resources right now if they haven't been able to.
Great, thank you.
Great, so just wanted to remind everybody that we will send out an email survey following the webinar early next week so that you all can provide feedback on this survey on motivational interviewing. We will also, along with that email, we will relink all the handouts from Wendy's information today, and we will link the worksheet that Patty sent to Kelly. And all of this information will also be placed in the Coaching Companion and the DEL Coaching Toolkit. So just a reminder that if you weren't able to access something prior to the webinar, we will be resending, and they will live places so that you're able to access them again. So if there are no more questions, we just want to remind everybody that the next webinar will be Friday, March 2nd at 9 a.m. And we will send both the invitation and the reminder for that webinar with a link to the Zoom meeting. So just a reminder, if you are not receiving these emails, to contact myself, Jen Fung, and maybe copy Mark McCarty so that we can work with you to address those issues. So thank you, everybody, for your time today and your great feedback. Happy Friday. We hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.